Did you know that there are two different games called Super Mario Bros. 2? Yep, the game Americans got as the second Super Mario game was actually a Japanese game called Doki Doki Oh, you already know? Literally everyone knows this? Well, alright. Yeah, I don't own Mario 2 or Lost Levels, so we're just gonna move on. Development on Super Mario Bros. 3 began in spring of 1986, almost immediately after finishing work on the Lost Levels. At first, Nintendo attempted to create the game as a top-down action platformer, taking inspiration from their own Legend of Zelda, but quickly realized this perspective would not be ideal for the genre, as it would be next to impossible to tell whether or not Mario's feet were actually touching the ground. To think we could have gotten a side-scrolling Zelda and a top-down Mario. That's nuts. Nintendo instead stuck to the tried-and-true side-scrolling perspective, but designer Takashi Tezuka was determined to make the third entry of Super Mario Bros. Stand out despite this. He didn't want the game to just be rearranged versions of existing stages like Lost Levels had been, and he was also set on overhauling the sprites and backgrounds to make the entire experience feel brand new. Mario's sprites are larger and more detailed, as are the enemies, and the backgrounds are filled with wires and screws, as well as each level ending with a black curtain, making the whole thing feel like a stage play, which apparently is the canonical setting of the game according to Shigeru Miyamoto. Future remasters and remakes of the game would redesign the scenery to downplay this angle, but it's interesting to look back at a time when Nintendo treated the Mario cast less as characters and more as real-life celebrities putting on a performance for the player. This was also the game that established the platforming trope of each level fitting a theme, with every map having a unique aesthetic and gimmick to it, as opposed to Mario 1's cycle of the same 4 level types repeated over and over with a darker palette each time. The map's names even blatantly depict this: Grassland, Waterland, Giant Land, etc. This ensures that not only will each level be visually distinctive, but also contain obstacles and enemies that tie into the theme, such as the frozen coin blocks in Iceland or the, well, giant enemies in Giant Land. So yeah, if you ever wondered why platformers always have the lava level and the mountain level or whatever, that actually started in Mario 3. Levels themselves play out very similarly to Mario 1 and Lost Levels, but with a few notable changes. For one, the screen can scroll to the left now, giving you more room to play around with enemies and obstacles, as well as line up tricky jumps, assuming the level isn't an auto-scroller. Yeah, side effect of 80s game design is that developers hadn't yet learned that everybody hates auto-scroll levels. Mario also has a run meter, which fills as he manages to retain his max speed, and at its fullest, Mario's jump is enhanced, giving him more height and distance. By pairing this with either of the new Raccoon or Tanuki suit power-ups, Mario will be able to fly, which can be used to bypass large segments of levels entirely when used correctly. Speaking of power-ups, there are way more of those this time around. There's the returning Super Mushrooms and Fire Flowers, and the aforementioned Raccoon and Tanuki suits, the latter being similar to the former but with the added ability to become impervious to damage for a few seconds. There's also the Frog suit, which limits Mario's movement on land but greatly improves it when in the water, and the Hammer suit, which turns Mario into a Hammer Bro, allowing me to finally give the game a taste of its own damn medicine. Oh, shit. There's also the Karibo shoe, a power-up you can receive by defeating a specific type of enemy, which allows Mario to cross treacherous terrain without taking damage, as well as the P-Wing, which keeps Mario's run meter full, allowing him to take flight at any time, but it will still be lost upon taking damage like any other power-up, meaning you still have to be careful. The P-Wing is a limited power-up that is hidden at certain points on each map, making each use of it a strategic decision. Speaking of maps, that's probably the most significant addition to Mario 3 in terms of structure, and is the biggest remnant of the original plan for the game to be a top-down game. Instead of each level just immediately leading into the next, the player travels along a grid map, with various waypoints placed along the path. These are usually just basic levels, but there are also warp pipes that can lead to shortcuts, and various mushroom houses and minigames as well. Most of these are out in the open and simply feature randomized prizes, but others are hidden and have to be revealed by achieving hyper-specific criteria in certain levels, or discovering alternate paths. And these hidden houses give specific super rare rewards. In addition to standard levels and mushroom houses, wandering Hammer Bros can be confronted to receive bonus power-ups. Another major upgrade to Mario 3 is the player's ability to collect power-ups. Like, literally collect them. The player has an inventory of around 15 or so items that they can carry, which can be activated on the map to grant Mario power-ups on command or unlock new areas on the map. Activating a power-up simply grants Mario that power-up for the next level he enters, including the Power Star, which allows the player to start a level with a few seconds of invincibility. The Cloud power-up allows the player to skip one level, the Hammer allows you to break rock barricades on the map, the Anchor keeps the boss's airship from changing location should you lose a life there, and the Warp Whistle allows you to warp to a new map entirely, but no more than 2 maps ahead. And gee, doesn't that whistle sound familiar? The usefulness of these 4 items in particular means they are limited and only granted to the player at specific points, so it's up to the player to decide if and when to use them. Losing a life in a level will boot you back to the world map, and any Hammer Bros still remaining will shift position as usual, but there are otherwise no real penalties for losing a life. And with the ability to activate power-ups before entering each level, Mario 3 ends up being quite a bit friendlier in terms of difficulty. There definitely seem to be a lot fewer unfair deaths this time around, at least. Combine this with a much more impressive presentation, and you have one of the most purely enjoyable Mario games out there. And indeed, Super Mario Bros. 3 took the world by storm upon its launch in 1988. Hype for the game was massive. It was easily the most anticipated game ever released up to that point. And even today, it's still held up as one of the greatest platformers ever made. It established the formula that 2D Mario still adhere to even today, via the new Super Mario Bros. Series. Debates still rage about whether Mario 3 is the best Mario game, period. And apologies to those people, but I am a Mario World stan through and through. The groundwork laid by Mario 3 continues to be felt in platformers to this very day, and its impact on the gaming scene can't be overstated. Super Mario Bros. 3 is a monument not only to Mario, not only to Nintendo, and not only to platformers, but to gaming entirely. After the first Final Fantasy game exceeded Square's sales expectations, plans for a sequel were put into motion as soon as possible. Square's A-Team was expanded from a team of 6 to 15, with Hironobu Sakaguchi again taking the role of director. However, the original Final Fantasy hadn't been written with a sequel in mind, and so instead of a continuation of the original game's story, the sequel would have its own unique plot, outlined by Sakaguchi himself, while the script and scenario would be written by newcomer Kenji Terada. Yoshitaka Amano again contributed the game's artwork, Nobuo Uematsu would again score the music, and Nasir Jabeli returned to his programming role. Final Fantasy II would release on December 17, 1988, exactly 364 days after the release of the original game. Final Fantasy II would place much larger emphasis on its story, world, and characters than the first game did, to the point where Sakaguchi has claimed that the story was created first and the game was then designed around the narrative. This focus on story is made evident from the very beginning. The game begins with a scripted sequence of cutscenes, and the player characters have their own backstories, personalities, and actual lines of dialogue. In fact, the entire game is littered with scripted sequences, in contrast to the original game where every bit of information was provided by singular text boxes from NPCs. There are also recurring non-playable characters that act as supporting cast throughout the story, really serving to flesh out the game's world, and the party is constantly seeing new members enter and leave their group as the story dictates. The plot itself follows the story of 4 orphaned youths from the Kingdom of Fynn, who fled from their home after the invasion of the Palamecian Empire, which overthrew their princess and killed their parents. Firion, Guy, Maria, and her older brother Leon are attacked and felled by the Empire's forces as they attempt to escape, but are rescued by a white mage named Minwu and taken to the nearby town of Altair, and when they awake, they find Leon missing. The group joins the Wild Rose Rebellion, led by the usurped Princess Hilda, to rise up against the Palamecian Emperor, as well as find out the fate of their missing friend. Along the way, they'll recruit the help of various new characters who aid in the rebels' cause, and face up against a villain so formidable, hell itself could not contain him. Oh man, I don't know what happened with the footage there. It got all mixed up. Weird. Despite this deeper focus on story, and the game's recycled graphical assets from the first title, Square wasn't ready to rest on their laurels when it came to the actual gameplay. The character progression and battle system in FF2 has seen a massive restructuring, to the point where it barely even resembles the original game anymore. Yeah, you still have the superficial RPG elements like random encounters, turn-based battles, equipment, and spells, but the rest of the game is far more complex than you might expect. For one, the battle screen itself has been visually streamlined compared to the first game. The layout is now more wide open, with all the menus consolidated to the bottom of the screen, resulting in a much cleaner and simplified look that would then become the norm for future entries. Enemies can drop items now, and the array of items available has been greatly expanded. Potions, antidotes, tents, and cabins all return from the previous game, but ethers and phoenix downs also make their first appearances. And yes, the latter of which can actually be used during battle now. There are specific items to cure every individual status ailment in the game, as well as what I like to call spell-in-a-bottle items, which allow the player to cast powerful spells for free one time only. However, the player needs to be careful about packing too many items at once. Inventory space is limited to about 20 or so items, and in addition to key story items being required to share that space, duplicate items do not stack. Bringing along 6 Phoenix Downs means they'll take up 6 spaces of inventory. And when it comes to using items during battle, the party isn't given access to the larger inventory at all, and can only use items being kept in their spare equipment slots, of which they're only afforded 2. It does seem a bit weird to offer such a robust selection of items only to discourage exploring the usefulness of said items by severely limiting the player's inventory. There are still no in-game item descriptions, nor any way to quickly move from character to character on equipment screens, but the game does illustrate changes in offense and defense when equipping new weapons and armor. Although it doesn't immediately show changes to the more tertiary stats like evasion, magic defense, and the like, this is still an improvement. In terms of structure, the emphasis on story means the player is given clear direction for most of the game, and a new keyword system has the player learning important phrases and repeating them back to specific NPCs to unveil more of the plot. Saving can now be done anytime on the world map, and you can have multiple save files now, that's always nice. You can still open a world map by pressing B and select, and yeah, this globe thing is an impressive graphical effect for the NES, but it sucks. I mean, look at it. Dungeon design is also a lot less conducive for backtracking than in the first game, but I'm willing to forgive this because the player has access to the warp and exit spells from very early on. The only times where the dungeon design becomes a real issue is the handful of instances where warp and exit cannot be used, and that's usually for story-related reasons. The dungeons also have a habit of sticking multiple choice doors in your path, with most of them leading to dead-end rooms with increased encounter rates against typically tougher enemies. But it doesn't spawn you in the room next to the door you just entered. No, it drops you right in the middle. So you can imagine how easy it is to get caught in a fight you weren't ready for, and not a single dungeon in the game is spared of these stupid multiple choice doors. The game also sees a lot of Final Fantasy firsts. Chocobos make their first appearance, as well as the tradition of having a character named Cid. FF2 would also make attempts to build its own catalog of unique lore and monsters, as opposed to just copying D&D. Longtime FF monsters like Bombs, Flans, and Gigants make their debuts here, as well as recurring weapons like the Blood Swords, which, take my advice, you'll definitely want to hold on to despite their low stats and your limited inventory space. They deal damage on a percentage basis, and recover the user's HP, making them incredibly effective boss slayers, especially when combined with the Berserk and Haste spells. Keep them in your character's spare equipment slots, and you'll even be able to swap weapons during battle when need be. Also, slight tangent here, but a surprising amount of enemies in this game are vulnerable to the Toad spell, which in this game acts the same as a KO, because now you're a Toad. Even normally hardy enemies aren't immune to this spell if you level it up enough. Lamia Queens? Toaded. Malboros? Toaded. Abyss Worms? Toaded. Seriously, level up Toad. You won't regret it. Characters still don't auto-retarget in battle upon an enemy's death, but several changes have been made to the battle system. For one, character order has been replaced with a front row, back row system, with characters in the back row being protected from any close-range weaponry or attacks, while also being unable to use close-range weapons or attacks. The party's max HP has been upped from triple to quadruple digits, and MP has been reworked completely. Rather than the Vancian system from the first game, each character now just has a singular MP pool for casting spells, like in later entries. Spells also level up to a maximum of 16 with repeated use, increasing their overall usefulness, with each spell's MP cost being equal to its current level. And this brings me to the most controversial aspect of FF2's gameplay. Final Fantasy II ditches character EXP entirely, instead opting for a system wherein characters become more proficient with whatever abilities and weapons they use the most. Where FF1 had the player choosing their classes and specialties right at the start, every character in FF2 begins as essentially a blank slate, capable of equipping any weapon or piece of armor they want and learning any spell available. Similar to how spells level up, repeated use of a weapon or shield will increase the character's proficiency with said weapon or shield. And this also carries over to general stats. If a character spends most of their time attacking physically, their strength stat will see gradual boosts. If a character is constantly being hit, their defense will improve. If a character spends most of their time casting white magic, their spirit stat will increase. Likewise with black magic and the intelligence stat. If a character spends over a quarter of their total MP in a single fight, there's a chance that their MP total will increase. Certain stats are also opposed to one another, creating a sort of seesaw effect. If one stat goes up, there's a good chance the opposite stat will go down. So for example, strength and intelligence are opposed, making it unviable for a character to be proficient at both attacking and black magic. Now, in theory, this is all meant to open up the game and give the player much more freedom to build their team the way they want. And if you've ever played any of the SaGa games, you'll notice that a very similar system is employed there. And indeed, this is not a coincidence. SaGa director Akitoshi Kawazu acted as one of FF2's game designers. In practice, though, this first appearance of the system required a lot more fine-tuning. For instance, if you want to increase your max MP, your character is going to have to cast enough spells in one battle to use up at least a quarter of their total to even have a chance of that number being increased. This is the same for leveling up spells as a whole. You need to repeatedly cast the same spell over and over in order to power it up, meaning a lot of turns are going to be spent casting spells you don't actually need to use. And believe me, you'll need to level up those spells. For example, the Estina spell can only heal certain status effects once it reaches certain levels, so it's a spell you desperately want to have leveled up ahead of time. So your characters are going to spend a lot of time wasting MP, requiring you to spend more time and resources recovering those lost points, since playing it safe and reserving your MP means you'll likely never actually see your MP or spells level up. Similarly, stats like defense and HP are dependent on your characters actually taking damage in the first place, meaning characters kept in the back row can easily fall behind. Defense and magic defense increase the more your character is hit by the appropriate type of attack, but HP operates similarly to MP. You have to lose a certain percentage of your HP in the same battle to even qualify for the opportunity of improvement. In addition, every piece of equipment in the game has a magic penalty stat, with certain weapon types, such as bows and swords, as well as most heavy armors, having huge detrimental effects on spells, which punishes players for trying to equip magic-focused characters with high-end armor. I assume this is sort of meant to evoke the same system used in the first game, where spellcasting classes typically weren't allowed to equip heavy armors. But between that and the opposing stat mechanic, the game is still forcing characters to specialize, meaning this really isn't as free-form a system as it may seem at first glance. And, in an absolutely baffling design decision, the magic penalty stat is completely invisible to the player. A vital aspect of the game mechanics is kept in hiding for seemingly no real reason. Even with all this, though, it's actually really easy to game this system. Defense and HP only increase when being attacked, sure, but the game doesn't care who's doing the attacking. Party members are capable of targeting each other, and this was largely done so that players could easily wake sleeping characters, but this also means players can have their party members whack the crap out of one another, and the game will still see this as worthy of stat progression.
What the hell are you doing? I'm kicking my ass, do you mind?
In addition, due to a programming oversight, if the player cancels a previously confirmed action, the game still logs the action as having been performed, allowing the player to artificially raise spell and weapon levels by just repeatedly confirming and canceling actions over and over. True, this is probably the single most tedious way to play this game, but the fact that it can be done at all means that FF2's system manages to be somehow incredibly unfair to the player and laughably easy to exploit all at once. And at the end of the day, how do you balance a game where the player can be either hopelessly underleveled or hideously overpowered at any given point? I appreciate Square's willingness to experiment, and the simple fact that this system spawned an entirely separate franchise shows that the potential was there. But Final Fantasy II is easily my least favorite of the franchise in terms of raw gameplay. That the game opens up with a scripted battle sequence wherein the player's party is helplessly defeated in a single turn is a hilariously apt and prophetic first impression. Even just doing a casual playthrough of this game to collect footage for this video ended up really trying my patience. The game is frankly just no goddamn fun, and it's probably the only mainline numbered Final Fantasy entry that I would recommend completely skipping. Later ports and remakes of FF2 would faithfully stick to the original gameplay, albeit with a few improvements. It can't be exploited anymore for one thing, but the opposing stat mechanic was eventually removed, and spells and weapons now level up at a quicker pace. Later releases also fix a few of the original's bugs, which thankfully were less numerous than FF1's bugs, but still. The Pixel remaster even finally made the magic penalty stat a visible value now. Hey, it only took them 30 years. Even with all the changes the later re-releases made, I'd still say it's not really worth it, but if you insist on trying this game in some form, just avoid the NES release at all costs. There's no reason to play this version outside of its historical value. Final Fantasy II in its original form was never released outside of Japan. So yes, that means I'm technically breaking the rules of my own list since I don't actually own a copy of this game. I'm playing an unofficial fan translation on an emulator. But I'm an FF fanboy, and I wanted to play every numbered entry, so you'll just have to forgive me. FF2 was at one point planned for an English localization, but the original Final Fantasy wasn't released in English until 1990. By then, Final Fantasy III was already out in Japan, and the Super Nintendo and Final Fantasy IV were on the horizon. Work on an English release of FF2, given the subtitle Dark Shadow over Palakia, was begun and planned for a 1991 release. But Nintendo of America apparently felt it better worth their time to focus on getting the fresher, more impressive Final Fantasy IV localized instead. And ironically, that game would be renamed Final Fantasy II in the West to avoid the confusion caused by skipping two titles. The original FF2 localization was eventually leaked online though, demonstrating that it was in nowhere near a complete state by the time it was ultimately cancelled. Personally, I think it worked out for the best in the long run. FF2 is such an unwieldy, grueling experience that it likely would have completely turned off players of the first game. Keep in mind that RPGs were always fighting an uphill battle back then, and I think FF2 would have sworn most Americans off of the genre completely. What was it with NES sequels being super difficult versions of their predecessors back in the 80s? First Mario Lost Levels, then Zelda 2, now Final Fantasy 2. I guess game publishers just really wanted to keep people guessing back then, huh? Upon the release of the first Mega Man in 1987, sales were not incredibly impressive. Capcom had no plans to pursue a sequel, but the team involved with the game was still passionate about what they had made, and eventually managed to get a sequel greenlit by Capcom executives. On one condition, that is. They had to work on the game in tandem with their currently assigned projects. There could not be any delays on games currently being developed. The team reportedly worked 20-hour days, often staying at the office overnight to moonlight on this project. Capcom would invite fans to submit ideas for the sequel's boss characters, and the team would receive well over 8,000 submissions. The final winning designs were slightly tweaked by the team, and they would also revisit several ideas that had to be cut from the first game. In the end, Mega Man 2 would be finished in just a scant 4 to 5 months, and was released on Christmas Eve of 1988. The story of Mega Man 2 sees the returning Dr. Wily escaping his confinement and creating 8 new Robot Masters with which to take his revenge on Dr. Light and Mega Man. It's once again up to our hero to defeat the Robot Masters and subdue Dr. Wily, and the game opens with one of the sickest intros ever. It's brilliant, elegant, simple, yet triumphant, exhilarating. The reprise of the ending theme from the first game sets the mood, as the camera pans up the side of a massive skyscraper to eventually reveal the main character in all his glory, just as the music transitions into a new high-energy theme that would soon become an iconic staple of the franchise. And there's Mega Man, standing confident atop the building, helmetless, his hair blowing dramatically in the wind, ready for action. And yeah, I know I neglected to bring up the music for Mega Man 1 last time, and that's because, well, the tracks are certainly catchy, but none are particularly iconic in my opinion. Though I am rather fond of Elecman's theme, that might just be because it was later blatantly plagiarized in a Digimon game. Or who knows, maybe both composers were just really big Journey fans. Mega Man 2, though, this is easily one of the best soundtracks in the series. In addition to the excellent new opening theme, 2 tracks in particular, Wily Stage 1 and Airman, became instant classics, even spawning meme remixes like Okusen Man and I Can't Defeat Airman. Every track in this game is a winner in my book. Classic Mega Man games are often criticized for being samey, feeling like assembly line sequels ad-libbed onto slightly different packages year after year. And that's certainly true for the NES era games. Mega Man 2 is a bit more graphically creative and impressive than Mega Man 1, but nonetheless, there is still a lot of asset reuse here. In light of this copy-paste sequel design throughout the franchise, the classic Mega Man entries are defined by their Robot Masters. After all, our main character's skills are gained from the enemies he defeats. The total number of Robot Masters would be increased from 6 to 8 here, and this would become the standard number for the franchise moving forward. Narratively, the choice to have these Robot Masters be created by Wily himself allows the game designers more freedom to explore whatever crazy boss ideas they may have. The Robot Masters in the first game were framed in the lore as being designed by Dr. Light for practical human purposes, such as excavation, demolition, and the like, before Wily hijacked and reprogrammed them. Wily, though, is a madman, and so his Robot Masters can be created for whatever task he wants, including just stopping Mega Man at all costs. The roster this time is made up of Airman, Bubbleman, Crashman, Flashman, Metalman, Woodman, Quickman, and Heatman, who we promise is totally not the same thing as Fireman, guys, honest. Just like the first game, defeating each Robot Master results in Mega Man gaining their powers for his own use. And in addition, special traversal tools can also be gained, such as platforms for scaling walls or pits, and a jet board for crossing wide gaps. These items were reportedly added to the sequel in response to criticisms of the first game's high difficulty, but they still use limited ammo just like the Robot Master weapons, and so they can't be easily used. The weapons in Mega Man 2 are overall better than Mega Man 1, but they can also be hilariously unbalanced for the opposite reason as the last game. The Metal Blade in particular is, without question, the most abusable Robot Master weapon in the classic series. They can be fired in 8 directions, travel through most walls, they can be fired rapidly, their ammo consumption is paltry, and most enemies in Mega Man 2 are weak to them. Heck, half of the Robot Masters themselves fall victim to this weapon, including Metal Man himself, which turns the rock, paper, scissors boss progression from the first game into more of a sprawling web than a strict loop. There's really no reason not to start every run of the game with defeating Metal Man, since from there, Woodman, Bubble Man, and Flash Man are all made viable targets. Aside from Metal Blades, there are other good weapons in this game, like the Quick Boomerang, Crash Bomb, and even Leaf Shield. But Metal Blades are so ridiculously reliable, there's really little reason to experiment with anything else. Mega Man 2 also introduces a new staple to the series in the form of energy tanks, or E-tanks for short, full health restorative items that the player can use on command from the pause menu. These are located in set locations throughout the game, and the player can stockpile up to 4 of them at once. Unfortunately, although they can be preserved using passwords— oh yeah, by the way, the game has passwords now— E-tanks aren't retained if the player gets a game over, which can be incredibly annoying once the player reaches the endgame because the Wily Fortress levels in Mega Man 2 are fucking terrible. And I don't just mean that in a whiny, they're too hard way. I mean, they're actually designed really badly. For instance, there's this part in Wily Stage 1 where you need to use Item 1 to create floating platforms and perform a tricky jump to grab this low-hanging ladder. Alright, no problem. Bit tricky, but you can get it with enough tries. But if you die to the boss afterwards, the checkpoint places you before this hanging ladder, and since your ammo isn't replenished upon losing a life, you can easily find yourself completely out of Item 1 ammo and thus unable to progress with no convenient method to replenish your ammo. But I can deal with checkpoints being placed too far apart, despite every other level placing checkpoints just before each boss. I can deal with the falling tunnel lined with insta-death spikes. There were plenty of tricky moments in the game before this. Heatman's disappearing blocks and especially Quickman's instant death lasers come to mind. What I can't deal with is an absolutely obnoxiously designed puzzle boss placed 4 levels into a 6-stage gauntlet where failing even once means you literally won't have enough ammo to defeat them the next time. The boss in question is the Boo Beam Trap, a group of wall-mounted turrets protected by reinforced walls, and both the turrets and walls are only vulnerable to a single weapon, the Crash Bombs. Problem is, even if you enter the boss arena with full Crash Bomb ammo, you'll need to use every last shot to win, and that includes landing a trick shot to destroy at least 1 wall and 1 turret with the same bomb. If you screw up and run out of Crash Bombs, you become unable to win this fight, as the boss isn't vulnerable to any other weapon. There isn't any reasonably quick way to replenish your ammo should you die, so even though any destroyed walls will remain so if you lose a life, assuming it wasn't a game over, it isn't exactly easy to replenish your Crash Bomb ammo for the second attempt. It's honestly faster to lose your lives and get a game over on purpose, thus losing any E-tanks you had, by the way, just so you can start the level over with full ammo. Sorry, better luck next time. It's just such a pain in the ass for no reason. The boss itself isn't hard. It follows a predictable attack pattern and each turret dies in 1 shot. It's just that the level designers didn't account for how much Crash Bomb ammo the player can actually carry when they decided on the number of targets. And God forbid the player use even a single Crash Bomb before getting to the boss. Adding to all this frustration is the simple fact that all 6 Wily levels have to be done in a single sitting, or else all progress in them is lost. And so with every game over the player receives from that point, they have the choice of either using a password save to start from the beginning with their E-tanks intact, or just accept the loss of their E-tanks and soldier on without the backup health supply. Once you're past the Boo Beam Trap, all that's left is the Robot Master rematches, which mercifully drop health recoveries upon defeat, and the battles with Wily. None of those are overly difficult, thankfully, but the Boo Beam Trap left such a bad taste in my mouth that my patience was already far past its limits by then. Despite this stumble at the finish line, though, Mega Man 2 is a clear improvement over its predecessor in basically every way. I don't personally think it's the best of the classic Mega Man series. It is good, don't get me wrong, but I think its quality is often overstated simply due to how much better it is than the first game. But the numbers don't lie, as they say. Mega Man 2 would sell over 1.5 million copies, making it the highest selling game in the series until Mega Man 11 in 2018, a whole 30 years later. It would be critically acclaimed as a staple of platforming games, and held up as the entry that made all future sequels and spin-offs possible. But I think the most admirable thing about Mega Man 2 really is just how much the team behind it had faith in what they were creating, working ridiculous hours every day for months on end to finish a product they cared about that their bosses had next to no faith in. Despite the absolutely hellish development schedule Mega Man 2 was under, Keiji Inafune has since said that the time he spent working on this game was the most stressful but rewarding and fulfilling period of his career. The love this team had for what they were making shines through in the end. A passion project that proved itself a masterpiece in the face of a company that never thought it would succeed.